Thank you for listening to the Council of Institutional Investors Voice of Corporate Governance, the #1 corporate governance podcast in the U.S. for 2025, as determined by Million Podcasts. I'm your host, Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of CII. The purpose of these monthly episodes is to update CII members and the general public on significant developments in corporate governance, in capital markets regulation, and CII's related advocacy activities. This update covers a period from April 30th to May 28th, 2026. The following is my top 10 list of events over that period. Number 10, on May 6th, the SOC Investment Group and the American Federation of Teachers both sent letters asking the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to probe into SpaceX's reported accounting and governance issues before the initial public offering is allowed to proceed. The SOC Investment Group writes, "We are specifically concerned that SpaceX IPO will impose numerous investors, many unwillingly, to a company whose value may decline once its financial disclosures can be independently assessed and verified." The SOC Investment Group adds, "We are also concerned that the control person of the company has been cited on numerous occasions by the SEC for violating the securities rules." Letter points to at least 3 specific concerns. 1, related party transactions involving the other companies that Elon Musk controls. 2, revenue and earnings related to distinguishing capital expenditures from research and development expenses and appropriate depreciation assumptions. 3, former Department of Government Efficiency employees who previously worked for the CEO, now either working or consulting at the SEC. Letter states, "We urge the Commission to ensure that SpaceX registration statement is not made effective until expert staff are satisfied that the document fully reflects an accurate, complete, and reliable description of the offering, the financial condition of SpaceX, and any risks that potential investors should be aware of." In a separate letter, the American Federation of Teachers warns the breadth of the disclosure, accounting, and governance issues associated with the SpaceX offering will significantly affect American Federation of Teachers members and their benefit funds, given the size of the offering and the degree to which it is being marketed to retail investors who are estimated to be receiving 30% of the offering. American Federation of Teachers asked the SEC to scrutinize at least 3 areas. 1, risk factors around the core issue of how and when SpaceX will generate sufficient earnings to support its current reported offering price of approximately 200 times cash flows. 2, aggressive and possibly non-GAAP accounting practices at SpaceX, particularly in relation to revenue recognition and related party transactions. And 3, the independence of the board, especially given the reported dual-class share structure and limitations on actionable shareholder rights under recent Texas state security law changes. In conclusion, the American Federation of Teachers letter urges the SEC to thoroughly examine the S-1 and require SpaceX, its independent auditor, NASDAQ, and NASDAQ index fund managers to fully comply with all of the provisions of the securities laws affecting this offering. On May 20th, the SpaceX S-1 was publicly released. The S-1 reveals at least 6 government-related provisions that grant the CEO almost total control over SpaceX. 1, a dual-class system under which outside investors of SpaceX are able to buy Class A shares, which confer 1 vote apiece, while the CEO owns more than 5.5 billion Class B shares, which carry 10 votes per share. As a result, Mr. Musk has about 94% of SpaceX Class B shares and 85% of all votes. As a result of these holdings, the CEO has the power to appoint a majority of board seats and cannot be removed from the CEO position without his own consent. Number 2, a 3% ownership threshold is required for shareholders to initiate derivative lawsuits, meaning based on the expected valuation of $1.75 trillion, shareholders would need at least 52.5 billion in shares to bring a lawsuit against the board or executives. Number 3, a requirement that to file a shareholder proposal, a shareholder must hold at least 3% of SpaceX voting shares for at least 6 months before the date of the annual meeting. It must solicit holders of shares representing at least 67% of the voting power. Number 4, provision allowing the company to ban class action lawsuits and route any legal claims against it for any alleged violations of federal securities laws into either the Texas state court system or into private arbitrations. Number 5, a board that is not composed of a majority of independent directors, and there is no requirement that committees of independent board members set executive compensation or nominate directors. And number 6, a provision combining the roles of chairman, CEO, and chief technical officer in Elon Musk. In a May 20th statement, Natalia Renta, Associate Director of Corporate Governance and Power at Americans for Financial Reform, said, "This IPO is poised to benefit early investors by allowing them to cash out at an arguably inflated share price." Renta warned that the corresponding reality is that regular investors, including workers saving for retirement, are likely to end up holding the bag by being exposed to index funds that buy SpaceX shares soon after the public offering and before the market has had a meaningful chance to properly price them. Number 9. On May 13th, U.S. Senate Banking Committee Ranking Member Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts sent a letter to U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission Chair Paul Atkins and U.S. Secretary Treasury Scott Bessent requesting information about the agency's efforts to address the growing risks of private credit markets. Ranking Member Warren criticized the SEC for proposing a rule that would facilitate 401k plan fiduciaries offering alternative investments, including private credit for retirement plans, and for issuing a joint proposal with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission that would reduce Form PF reporting requirements. Ranking Member Warren explained that the Form PF is a confidential form on which certain SEC-registered investment advisors to private funds report information that helps the SEC to understand potential systemic risk. In the letter, Ranking Member Warren requested information from the SEC on at least 2 items. 1, how the proposed amendments to Form PF would affect the Commission's ability to monitor risk to investors and the market from weakness in private credit. And 2, the steps the SEC intends to take to assess systemic risk in the private fund market and broader economy. In addition, Ranking Member Warren inquired about whether the Financial Stability Oversight Council has recommended any supervisory or regulatory priorities or principles, or identified any regulatory gaps that could pose risks to the stability of the U.S. financial system in relation to the rise of the private credit market and the increasing interconnectedness of bank and non-bank financial companies. And on May 12th, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, who sits on the Senate Banking Committee, sent letters to SEC Chair Atkins and Acting U.S. Labor Secretary Keith Sonderling, urging the agencies to pause efforts to place alternative assets, including private market investments, into Americans' 401k and other defined contribution retirement plans, and requesting that the SEC conduct a review of valuation and sales practices for retail private credit vehicles. More specifically, Senator Reed requests that the SEC examine the sales practices used to place private credit with retail investors. Number 8. On May 11th, Brian Kemp, the governor of the state of Georgia, signed into law HB 1185, which is effective July 1st, 2026. HB 1185 updates the state's corporate governance and shareholder litigation frameworks by allowing companies to take at least 4 actions. 1, eliminate or limit corporate officer liability for monetary damages, even for clear violations of law and fiduciary duty, like intentional misconduct, knowing violations of law, liability for unlawful distributions, and transactions involving improper personal benefits. 2, adopt provisions in their articles of corporation or bylaws requiring internal entity claims to be brought solely and exclusively in the state's business court. 3, limit shareholders' right to inspect books and records. And 4, establish an ownership threshold of up to 1% of outstanding shares as a precondition for filing a derivative lawsuit. Number 7. On May 20th, the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton filed suit against Institutional Shareholder Services, claiming that the proxy advisor violated the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act by advertising independent and objective advice while secretly prioritizing a private agenda. The suit argues that Institutional Shareholder Services does not provide objective and impartial investment advice, but instead provides advice influenced by its own ESG ideological considerations apart from its clients' best interests. Attorney General Paxton criticized Institutional Shareholder Services benchmark policies on greenhouse gas emissions and climate-related disclosures, as well as board diversity. Attorney General Paxton argues that ESG-focused funds are underperforming compared with broad equity markets, and the political landscape is moving away from environmental concerns and back to oil and gas. The lawsuit says it's clear from the aforementioned examples that ISS's commitment to ESG initiatives goes against both financial market trends and political trends and are not made in the best fiscal interests of its clients. Suit points to the appearance of Institutional Shareholder Services' name on the website for the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility and notes the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility's ESG agenda. Furthermore, Paxton says Institutional Shareholder Services, part of the Deutsche Börse group of companies, which is a member of the Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance, a group committed to the goal of achieving global net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 or sooner. Institutional Shareholder Services' other owner, General Atlantic, lists 2 of its 4 investment strategies as energy transition and sustainable infrastructure. The suit says that ISS's failure to disclose that the 2 companies comprising its ownership are ESG activists constitutes a further violation of the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Lawsuit asks the court to enjoin Institutional Shareholder Services from providing proxy advisory services without providing its customers with a clear and conspicuous notice of ISS's focus on ESG initiatives and require Institutional Shareholder Services to pay all attorneys' fees and costs. Number 6, the U.S. House of Representatives adopted by a vote of 396 to 13 H.R. 6646, the 21st Century Road to Housing Act legislation, intended to increase the U.S. housing supply by reducing unnecessary regulatory barriers to new home construction and modernizing housing and urban development programs and allowing banks to more freely deploy funding. The bill would also prohibit large institutional investors from purchasing or entering into a contract to directly or indirectly purchase any single-family home, subject to certain exceptions. The Senate-passed version of the bill, in contrast, would require institutional investors to sell build-to-rent homes within 7 years. White House issued a statement of policy noting that the administration, 1, supports passage of this bill and urges the Senate to take up and pass this legislation, and 2, requests both chambers resolve any remaining differences expeditiously. Accordingly, if the bill were presented to the president in its current form, his advisors would recommend he sign it into law. Number 5. On May 5th, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission released a proposed rule that would allow reporting companies to elect to file 1 semi-annual report on a Form 10S rather than 3 quarterly reports on Form 10Q. Council of Institutional Investors generally supports the current quarterly reporting model, believing it provides timely and accurate financial information that benefits investors, companies, and the markets. Quarterly reports help ensure transparency and allow investors to evaluate progress against strategic goals. The new Form 10S would require the same narrative disclosures and financial statements as Form 10Q, but over a 6-month rather than a 3-month period. The proposed rule would not change interim reporting requirements for foreign private issuers, which continue to be required to prepare interim reports in compliance with home country and stock exchange rules. In September 2025, President Donald Trump called for changes to permit companies to report on a 6-month rather than a quarterly basis. Back in December of 2018, the SEC issued a request for public comment on the nature, timing, and frequency of periodic reporting and how periodic reporting might affect companies' decision-making and strategic thinking. In response, CII sent a comment letter recommending that the SEC discourage quarterly forecasted earnings guidance rather than eliminate quarterly financial reporting. That CII letter also said that moving from required quarterly to semi-annual reporting would likely make U.S. stocks much more risky and more volatile and harm the efficiency of the financial markets. That CII letter also pointed out that more transparent and timely information reduces the risk of insider trading. The comment period for the current SEC proposal on semi-annual reporting ends on July 6, 2026. CII currently plans to submit a comment letter in response to the proposal. Number 4, on May 20th, The U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee's Capital Markets Subcommittee held a hearing to examine the structure of U.S. equity markets and evaluate whether the current Regulation National Market System framework continues to support a fair, orderly, and globally competitive market. Observing that in the over 2 decades since the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission adopted Regulation National Market System, technology has evolved, order routing has become more complex, and compliance costs have multiplied. Chairman Ann Wagner of Missouri argued that revisiting the central tenets of Regulation National Market System, such as Rule 611, will allow lawmakers to properly assess the effectiveness of market regulations and address any efficiencies. Chair Wagner also expressed support for SEC Chair Paul Atkins' comprehensive review of Regulation National Market System to determine how these rules can better serve investors, emphasizing that it is time to consider how modernizing equity market structure requires updating Regulation NMS. Ranking Minority Member Brad Sherman of California stressed that Regulation National Market System should be, if anything, strengthened, but certainly not dismantled. Ranking Member Sherman also expressed concern about the SEC's recently issued proposal to provide companies currently subject to quarterly reporting requirements with the option to instead file semi-annually, arguing that investors need more and better and quicker information that is more reliable, not less. Number 3, on May 15th, the Council of Institutional Investors sent a letter to the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Letter weighed in on priorities for the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board's 2026 to 2030 strategic plan. The CII letter recommended the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board focus include the following 8 items. 1, increasing the transparency of inspection results. 2, increasing the transparency of enforcement actions. 3, focusing a material amount of inspection enforcement resources on China-based registered audit firms. 4, considering as part of its risk-based selections for company audit inspections, the corporate law of the company's state of incorporation. 5, providing investors with decision-useful metrics about audit firms and individual audits. 6, increasing the number and quality of disclosures, critical audit matters. 7, continuing to evaluate developments in technology, including AI, and the consideration of the need for guidance, changes to Public Company Accounting Oversight Board standards, or other action in light of the increased use of technology by registered audit firms and financial statement preparers. And finally, 8, allocating sufficient resources to new approaches to improve the board's dialogue with investors and other stakeholders. Number 2, on May 19th, in an effort to incentivize companies to go and stay public, the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission proposed scaling back dramatically public companies' required reporting frameworks. The SEC's filer status proposal would result in at least 4 significant changes for SEC registrants. 1, it would raise the threshold for a public company to become a large accelerated filer from $700 million to $2 billion. In addition, a company would not become a large accelerated filer for at least 5 years following its initial public offering, regardless of its public float. 2, it would categorize all other public companies as non-accelerated filers that would be subject to nearly all disclosure, scaling, and other accommodations currently available to smaller and emerging companies, including exempt all non-accelerated filers from the requirement to obtain an auditor's attestation on their internal control over financial reporting. And 3, it would establish a subcategory of small non-accelerated filers that would receive an additional 30 days to file their Form 10K annual reports and an additional 5 days to file their Form 10Q quarterly reports. SEC Chair Paul Atkins explained in a statement, today, approximately 52% of companies benefit from some form of disclosure scaling and other accommodations. The proposed amendments extend all of those benefits to 81% of companies. Chair Atkins said the proposed rules make public company status more attractive by expanding existing benefits to more companies, simplifying the analysis required for a company to avail itself of those benefits, and enhancing certainty of how long a company receives them. Corporate law firm Skadden Arps estimates that all non-accelerated filers, which it says would be about 52% of registrants, but less than 1% of total public float under the streamlined categories as proposed by the SEC, would be exempt from at least 3 requirements. 1, the requirement to obtain a SOX 404B auditor attestation of management's assessment of the effectiveness of the company's internal control of financial reporting. 2, the requirements to hold say-on-pay and say-on-frequency advisory votes. And 3, providing pay versus performance disclosure. Dating back to 2006, Council of Institutional Investors filed over a dozen letters expressing opposition to eliminating the auditor attestation requirement for internal controls at public companies. In addition, CII was the primary author and public supporter of the legislation in Dodd-Frank that led to existing requirements for say-on-pay advisory votes. CII's executive director, Robert McCormick's take on the SEC proposal is that the SEC's proposal may make going public more attractive, but investors should question whether giving up transparency and accountability for the potential for more public companies is worth the trade-off. The comment period on the filer status proposal ends on July 20th, 2026. CI currently plans to submit a comment letter in response to that proposal. Also on May 19th, the SEC issued a second proposal for public comment to allow more public companies to be able to conduct shelf offerings, which allow quicker access to the public capital markets regardless of the company's public float. The comment deadline for this second proposal is July 27th, 2026. And my number one most significant development in U.S. corporate governance, capital markets regulation, for the period from April 30th to May 28th, 2026, occurred at 3 recent annual meetings when shareholders expressed their concerns about misalignments between pay and performance by voting against say-on-pay proposals. First, Citigroup. Citigroup shareholders registered their dissatisfaction with the company's executive compensation plan at its May 20th annual meeting, when just 60% cast their proxy votes for the bank's say-on-pay proposal, and 70% supported a proposal to add shares to the stock incentive plan. Lack of performance vesting criteria for the CEO's one-time equity award is problematic, notes ISS. This award consists of time-based restricted stock units with an approved value of $25 million and time-based stock options with an approved value of $35 million. The total of the award is almost 1.5 times the CEO's total pay for the fiscal 2025 performance year and almost 2 times the median CEO pay of the company's defined peers. The proxy does not disclose predetermined target or maximum pay opportunities or quantified threshold, target, and maximum performance goals. Institutional Shareholder Services notes that such disclosures are important for establishing a clear pay performance linkage as they communicate the committee's specific performance expectations and demonstrate both accountability for underperformance and appropriate awards for outperformance. Institutional Shareholder Services also says that Citigroup's plan to add 20 million shares to its stock incentive plan is problematic. Proxy advisor explains that the cost of the plan and its 3-year average burn rate are excessive. Its disclosure of how it treats change of control vesting is incomplete and allows too much discretion to accelerate vesting. Second is Welltower, where just 19% of Welltower shareholders voted for the company's say-on-pay proposal at the company's annual meeting on May 21st. The company gave the CEO a special grant award of $789 million, which is intended to cover the next decade of pay outside of his annual base salaries. While the achievement of the performance goals over that time period would result in value creation for shareholders, the value realized for the CEO could be in the billions. Institutional Shareholder Services noted that the amount is excessive even on an annualized basis over the 10-year period, even considering that he will only be eligible for a base salary over that time. Moreover, the lack of specific performance conditions on behalf of the award creates a massive time-based pay opportunity, and the design does not have specific performance hurdles applicable to the back half of the 10-year period. Further, the front-loaded design also creates a massive cost of any potential CEO transition over this period, as the time-based half of the award would be redeemable. In addition, if the CEO resigns, other than for good reason, his time-based long-term incentive plan shares will not fully and automatically be forfeited. And the third company was Thermo Fisher Scientific. At that company, just 32% of the shareholders voted to approve the executive compensation plan at the company's May 20th annual meeting. This is the second year in a row that the plan failed to pass. Last year, it received 36% of the votes cast. Following that vote, the company made considerable changes to its executive compensation, but still granted the CEO a retention award consisting of performance-based restricted stock with a target value of $57.7 million. Institutional Shareholder Services points out that the grant has a condition that does not require outperforming the median level of the peer group for the grant to pay out at target. Proxy advisor also notes that the award's magnitude adds considerable additional equity value to the CEO's annual pay, even when annualized over the 5-year period. Further, This was the second consecutive year that the committee awarded the CEO with a retention grant. Last year, he received $10.6 million. The Council of Institutional Investors Executive Director Robert McCormick's take on these three votes is that a large number of shareholders at each of these companies were clearly concerned enough about the misalignment between executive pay and company performance that they cast their proxy votes against say-on-pay proposals. As indicated on May 19th, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission proposed scaling back dramatically public companies' required reporting of their compensation frameworks. As also indicated under the proposal, Skadden Arps estimates that 52% of registrants would be exempt from providing pay versus performance disclosure, as well as holding say-on-pay and say-on-frequency votes. If shareholders are clearly concerned about these compensation issues, why is the SEC proposing to scale back the information available to them and to eliminate their means of expressing discontent? That completes my monthly update on significant developments in corporate governance and capital markets regulation. If you have any questions regarding any of the issues discussed, please feel free to email me at jeff@cii.org. Until next time, I'm Jeff Mahoney. Thanks again for listening to the Voice of Corporate Governance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Voice of Corporate Governance, brought to you by the Council of Institutional Investors. The Voice of Corporate Governance is a free, non-sponsored podcast that highlights critical developments in corporate governance and other important issues affecting institutional investors. The views expressed by those interviewed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of CII or its members. For more information on CII and its policies on corporate governance, please visit our website at www.cii.org.